Welcome to the Ash Cloud. I'm Ash Sweeting. Economics, markets, and policy all have significant impacts on human behaviour and decision making. Our guest today, Nick Parker, has been studying the human interaction with wolves, and especially the indirect effects, to examine if it was possible for wolves to actually benefit humans and reduce threats to human lives and property in modern times. Nick is the Morton Harris Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution and the Anderson Bascom Professor of Applied Economics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison.
The benefits in Wisconsin from a reduction in deer vehicle collisions that me and my co-authors attribute to the spread of wolves. We've talk about the details of this study, but we compare the timing of colonization of wolves in different counties in Wisconsin from the early 1990s to close to the present. And where wolves colonized these counties, we saw a 25% reduction in deer vehicle collisions. And we think 2/3 of that is due to wolves changing deer behavior rather than just eating deer. So then we took, what's the implied value of that reduction in deer vehicle collisions, due to lower probability of premature mortality of humans, which economists can put a statistical value to that. It's controversial, but we do. And what's the value of the property, the vehicle that was damaged? Add all that up, compare it to the verified losses due for ranch owners in Wisconsin due to direct predation from wolves, and that's a 63-to-1 number. So the benefits from wolves via the reduction in deer vehicle collisions is 63 times greater than the compensation payments the state was making.
Failure for policy to address the indirect effects has real opportunity costs.
Policy focuses on the direct effects, and the big economic impacts could be the indirect effects. So you mentioned this research in Yellowstone about the cascading effects of having an apex predator in the system, and so it funnels indirectly through the whole ecological system. Some of those secondary third effects are more important ecologically, perhaps, than the primary effect.
How large is the deer vehicle collision problem?
There's almost 2 million collisions annually between vehicles and deer. Lots of deer vehicle collisions in Canada, some in Europe as well. But these result in about 200 fatalities per year, 30,000 human injuries. And so these one risk of overabundant deer populations is you might hit one with your car. When I talk about this topic, sometimes I'll be in a room of people, certainly in the Midwest or the Northeast part of the US, and I'll say, raise your hand if you've been in a vehicle accident with a deer. Half the people raise their hand. And I said, raise your hand if a friend or a relative has been in an accident with a deer. Everybody in the room raises their hand, but they're so common.
There are broader impacts.
And they also eat farmers' crops, significant damage to timber. They impact household landscaping, so they get into gardens. They're potentially involved in the spread of Lyme disease, which can be fatal, very problematic. So deer vehicle collisions are one aspect of the damages caused by overabundance of ungulates like deer.
How do deer and wolves interact?
Theoretically, they could influence it through two channels. One is pretty obvious, is that they prey on deer, so they can reduce their populations. They can reduce the number of deer and hence reduce the probability that there'll just be deer around near roadways. Or the second is more interesting, and at least in our particular study, we find likely more important. But if you add wolves into a landscape that they previously weren't part of, that can really change the behavior of deer. Certainly in the short run, but maybe in the long run as well. In the short run, deer could change their mobility patterns. They could change where they congregate. Specifically, wolves could push them further away from roads. And so because deer are learning that the predators in the landscape, they're afraid of the predator, they want to avoid contact with it, they stay away. Where wolves have been radio collared, there's evidence that they prefer to travel along linear corridors like roads, creeks, riverbeds, because this can minimize their calorie use. And so wolves could reduce deer vehicle collisions or elk vehicle collisions just by changing their behavior.
Once again, the impacts are broader.
But the other thing an apex predator like a wolf does is it controls subservient predators like coyotes and fox and felines, so like bobcats and mountain lions. Doesn't necessarily control bear or mountain lions, but wolves compete with them and they can push them out of certain areas. And so the number one cause of livestock damage in the US is from coyotes.
The potential beneficiaries are also more complex.
One of the direct effects of large ungulate populations economically is it can be a local stimulus through hunting. And so you have these different and I think this feeds into your cost benefit analysis question. I mean, you have these different beneficiaries of large ungulate populations.
Economics is a powerful tool for optimizing natural resource use.
At all possible to set up a system that those who benefit compensate those who bear the cost, because as an economist, I think that's the gold standard for determining the optimal level of any natural resource use that's both an asset and a liability. Like wildlife is an asset and a liability. Some people want more, some people want less. Those who want more should pay for it, and those who bear the cost should be compensated in some way.
Patience and persistence is vital.
Hank Fisher worked for Defenders of Wildlife, advocate of wolf reintroduction, and he would go to these meetings with ranchers, and the ranchers would say things like, "Hank, I can't believe anybody hadn't killed you yet," because that's how unpopular he was. But he kind of worked both sides of the table, and he got the environmental group, the Defenders of Wildlife, to raise money to pay ranchers for their losses. And so, this was back in 1995, and now compensation payments are really common. They exist in France, where wolves have spread. They exist in Spain.
Economic opportunities continue to evolve.
We're going to pay them not only if they lose an animal due to predation, but just if they're hosting animals. And that kind of takes you to a next level of economic contracting, where I'm like, that's a pretty sophisticated contract, where and then it starts to change the incentives of the landowner. Like, oh, now this animal's more of an asset than a liability. And I'm recognizing that people value it. They're putting money where their mouth is. They're not just forcing it down my throat.
As does behavior.
Maybe at the margin, I install a more friendly wildlife fence that allows them to, elk to move more freely, because I actually wouldn't mind them on my property. I'm not trying to keep them out. And maybe I dedicate a little bit more of my land to wildlife habitat. And so
the implications of government policy should not be underestimated.
If you want long-term resource conservation and sustainability, we need policies that cause users of those resources to treat them like they're the owner. Now, we might not want to convey ownership. It might not be practical or politically feasible or even socially desirable for individuals and groups to own every natural resource. But if we have policies that encourage them to act as if they own it, then the incentives are going to be aligned for long-term conservation. And so
water policy is a major driver of overuse.
The governance of water and policies governing water that do not create strong incentives for long-run conservation, they don't mimic ownership arrangements. They don't allow the user to think of the resource as if they owned it, and hence a long run asset to try to preserve over time. One issue is there's often use it or lose it laws to waters for surface and groundwater. This is common across the world. So, you know, if you don't use the water, you lose your rights. So this is like the rule of capture.
Nick, thank you very much for joining me today.
It's great to be here.
At the end of the day, it's humans that make decisions on food sustainability. So our behavior and the impact that economics, markets, and policy has on our behavior is critical. You've been studying the human interaction with wolves and the direct and the indirect effects of that and how that affects behavior. Could you outline what you've learned through those studies?
Yes, so wolves have obvious direct effects on people, on human health potentially. They pose a risk because they're apex predators, but they've also have direct effects on human property. So since the beginning, big predators like lions, tigers, bears, and wolves, of course, were a threat to humans and the property they obtained. So in the earliest times, a human hunter could obtain a prey species and have the carcass, and of course their ownership of the carcass was threatened by a big predator who could be in the neighborhood. Over the years, as humans developed livestock operations, as we domesticated animals for rearing them, predators have remained a threat to the property of humans, and would often historically kill animals that people raise for profit. So human property, and they would sometimes kill humans as well. So these are the direct effects of a big predator like wolves. Historically, wolves are being introduced in various places of the world, and we can talk more about that in detail. But I've been interested in the indirect effects as well as the direct effects. So could it be possible that wolves could actually benefit humans, reduce threats to human risks of human threats to human lives? Could they actually protect human property in modern times? So that's a little teaser, I suppose, of some of the things I'm working on.
So what have you found in that space? Because to jump to the chase a bit, you found that the numbers of road accidents between humans and between cars and grazing animals, ungulates, could be decreased by wolves. So obviously that's not a natural thing. So can you talk through what you found and the research that you've done there?
Absolutely. So ungulates would include deer, elk, moose, and these animals are pretty abundant in many parts of the world today. They used to be scarce historically. So in the US, for example, there was estimates of 35 million deer around the time of Christopher Columbus. So around 1400, 1500, there was maybe 35 million deer within the continental US. Those numbers plummeted due to excessive market hunting under conditions of open access to deer, and plummeted to less than 1 million by 1900 due to coordinated conservation efforts. Those numbers are back to 35 million, which is kind of unbelievable, actually. So you have the same number of deer, one kind of ungulate, in the US that you had 500 years ago. But of course, you have millions more people. So there's lots more interactions between humans and deer. Less dramatic, but similar story for elk and moose, where you have more people and more animals due to successful conservation. But one of the residual effects of these large populations of ungulates is they cause damage to human property. One is they present a risk and present risk to human lives as well. So one is the potential that you're driving your vehicle in modern times and you hit a deer, you hit an elk, or you hit a moose. And that's an escalating ordering of a mortality risk. Actually, if you hit a moose, it's likely to not go well. And for an elk as well, and deer are smaller. But so, just collisions with deer in the US, I think I want to say there's almost 2 million collisions annually between vehicles and deer. Lots of deer vehicle collisions in Canada, some in Europe as well. But these result in about 200 fatalities per year, 30,000 human injuries. And so these one risk of overabundant deer populations is you might hit one with your car. If when I talk about this topic, sometimes I'll be in a room of people, certainly in the Midwest or the Northeast part of the US, and I'll say, raise your hand if you've been in a vehicle accident with a deer. Half the people raise their hand. And I said, raise your hand if a friend or a relative has been in an accident with a deer. Everybody in the room raises their hand, but they're so common. I personally hit an elk in Montana 2 years ago, so not a deer, but it was on the highway and it was dark and it was very scary. I mean, I didn't have any time to react. The elk just appeared right in my headlights. I literally had time to say, uh-oh, and then boom, hit the elk. My airbags deployed. I was not injured. My passenger was not injured. The elk was killed, but it completely wrecked the car. I mean, the car was totaled. This is one piece of damage from overabundant ungulates like deer. I mean, they also eat farmers' crops, significant damage to timber. They impact household landscaping, so they get into gardens. They're potentially involved in the spread of Lyme disease, which can be fatal, very problematic. So deer vehicle collisions are one aspect of the damages caused by overabundance of ungulates like deer.
So, and how do wolf populations impact the number of road accidents or vehicle accidents with deer?
Well, I mean, theoretically, they could influence it through two channels. One is pretty obvious, is that they prey on deer, so they can reduce their populations. They can reduce the number of deer and hence reduce the probability that there'll just be deer around near roadways in rural areas. And so that's one way that they affect deer vehicle collision. The second is more interesting, and at least in our particular study, we find likely more important. But if you add wolves into a landscape that they previously weren't part of, that can really change the behavior of deer. Certainly in the short run, but maybe in the long run as well. In the short run, deer could change their mobility patterns. They could change where they congregate. Specifically, wolves could push them further away from roads. And so because deer are learning that the predator's in the landscape, they're afraid of the predator, they want to avoid contact with it, they stay away. Where wolves have been radio collared, there's evidence that they prefer to travel along linear corridors like roads, creeks, riverbeds, because this can minimize their calorie use. And so if wolves are traveling on roads and deer learn that, then they can stay away. And so wolves could reduce deer vehicle collisions or elk vehicle collisions just by changing their behavior. In the longer run, the two can interact, where wolves are culling certain deer from the population, they're preying on them, And maybe through natural selection, those are the kind of deer that are more likely to be involved in deer vehicle collisions, perhaps the less shrewd part of the gene pool.
So there's also I guess the possibly quite famous example of the wolves in Yellowstone, where they changed the grazing pattern of the deer, and then they changed the nature of where the pastures are and where the forest was, and the emergence of saplings, and then that led to opportunities for beavers and things like that. Sort of ended up changing the course of the rivers. So I think there's a lot of I think the underlying fact is there's a lot of complexities in our behavior and in animals' behavior. And if you just have a very single, knock-a-mole, whack-a-mole approach where deer kill my livestock, I go and kill the deer, that's the indirect effects could outweigh, or the negative impact of the indirect effects could outweigh the positive benefit of a very direct impact. So moving on a bit to so what's your thoughts on that, I guess, to start off with?
Oh, I think that's really important. I think policy focuses on the direct effects, and the big economic impacts could be the indirect effects. So you mentioned this research in Yellowstone about the cascading effects of having an apex predator in the system, and so it funnels indirectly through the whole ecological system. Some of those secondary third effects are more important ecologically perhaps than the primary effect. And so I'm an economist, not an ecologist, but so we're trying to study these indirect effects through economic channels. And so, in terms of policy, I think you need to understand them. If you're trying to set policy towards predators or wildlife, it's actually going to benefit local communities, landowners, farmers. In a real way, you have to understand the whole system. So yeah, the direct effect are pretty easy to see. Wolves eat sheep, they eat lambs, they eat calves, and can have a significant negative effect through that direct effect on farmers' livelihood. Some of these profit margins are slim, and you lose a couple animals, you're in the red. And and so you get these political constituencies that are really opposed to wolves because they see these direct effects, they feel them, they're obvious. But indirectly, I mean, it's possible that, maybe theoretically wolves are a net benefit to some of these farmers. One effect is, or communities. So one effect is in the control of abundant deer populations and the damages that they cause. We talked about that. But the other thing an apex predator like a wolf does is it controls subservient predators like coyotes and fox and felines, so like bobcats and mountain lions. Doesn't necessarily control bear or mountain lions, but wolves compete with them and they can push them out of certain areas. And so these other predators are also a threat to farmers. I mean, that the livestock, actually the number one threat to the number one cause of livestock damage in the U.S. is from coyotes. And so if wolves reduce, I mean, that theoretically they might reduce some of those effects. And so then, indirectly, if you look just at the direct effect and don't net out the indirect effect, you could come to the wrong conclusion about whether wolves are good or bad economically for rural communities.
And I think there's also on top of that if you've got hundreds of deer grazing on your pastures, then there's a lot less pasture available for your livestock as well. So there's direct competition for food in there as well. And what you're saying makes a lot of it makes perfect sense, and we understand it's complex. We understand that the benefits um, are dispersed, and the problems, but the problem is, I guess, concentrated in you've seen the wolf kill an animal. Now, if you bring this back into the human side of things and how we think about that, and um, one very common tool is a cost benefit analysis that's used, or other similar tools to evaluate whether a policy is going to be implemented or not. How do you work through that human side of things with because the direct effects are very simple. The cost of hunting the wolf versus the cost of the livestock is a very simple equation to work out. Whereas once you start looking at all the other potential, the impact on other predators, the impact on Lyme's disease, vehicle accidents, etc., it becomes much more complex. So how do we need to think about that from that human perspective in terms of how do you value wolves in the positive effect, which is much more difficult than the cost of them in terms of direct damage, if that makes sense, what I've just asked.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense to me that, coming up with a good answer is difficult, but the question makes perfect sense. Just backtracking a moment on your earlier point that ungulates compete uh, uh, with livestock for forage. I mean, that's certainly the case in Paradise Valley, which is just north of Yellowstone Park, where the elk migrate through the valley, and there's ranchers that have livestock, and the elk certainly compete for forage with the livestock. So that's another interesting indirect interaction between the predator prey and profit from livestock. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention one of the big benefits to rural communities of ungulate populations is, hunting. Recreational hunting is still important in some parts of the world, certainly parts of the US, and it attracts revenue to local communities. And so one of the direct effects of large ungulate populations economically is it can be a local stimulus through hunting. And so you have these different and I think this feeds into your cost benefit analysis question. I mean, you have these different beneficiaries of large ungulate populations. You have those who bear the costs, and then you add a predator to that system, and it gets even more complicated with direct and indirect benefits and costs. So, I think the answer to your question is twofold. One is, how do we measure the benefits? I mean, the direct costs are easier to measure. We can see that livestock's been killed. We know how much it would have been sold on the market. We can peg a number to that, but the indirect benefits of wolves are hard to measure because they're dispersed. So that's one question, is how do you measure them? And the other is it at all possible to set up a system that those who benefit compensate those who bear the cost? Because as an economist, I think that's the gold standard for determining the optimal level of any natural resource use that's both an asset and a liability. Like wildlife is an asset and a liability. Some people want more, some people want less. Those who want more, should pay for it, and those who bear the cost should be compensated in some way. And so there's a question of understanding what these benefits and costs are, and then setting up a system such that those who get the benefits compensate those who bear the costs. So go ahead. Yeah.
So on that, it's that the ranchers got the wolves on their property, and there's going to be a certain loss of livestock, and then there's the person who's driving their car or their vehicle down the road, and they don't see a deer, they don't hit a deer, they just have a completely normal drive down a road where nothing happens, and then obviously they've benefited from the fact there are less or fewer deer on the road, but there's no trigger point to say I should have to pay for that benefit because nothing happens. So there's the perception of the two of them, and it's very easy to see how the rancher then goes, I'm just going to solve my problem and forget about all the other problems, because there's no trigger point to say, oh, I should have to pay for this fact that nothing happened when I drove down the road.
Absolutely. And the inverse is true. If I'm live in an urban area in Chicago or Washington, D.C., and I'm pushing for policy to reintroduce wolves in rural areas, they're not a threat to my economic livelihood, so I don't bear those costs either. So this is a symmetric problem where what we really want in a well-functioning economic system that will kind of push us towards some kind of optimal number of wolves in a system would be, yeah, those who get the benefits are meeting with those who bear the costs and coming up with some kind of cooperative agreement. And that's that's kind of how economic trade works, right? You get cooperative agreements through mutually beneficial exchanges. And so that's the gold standard, tricky to get there. But one starting point is compensating. One starting point is compensating ranchers who lose livestock to predators, is compensating them for their losses. That's like a starting point, and that's really what made the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone Park in 1995, which was one of the first reintroductions, and the one you mentioned that triggered these ecological studies. The way that became politically feasible is there was an agreement to compensate livestock owners for their losses. So the livestock owners were opposed because they thought there's no way wolves are going to stay in Yellowstone Park. They're going to spread into Wyoming and Idaho and Montana, and they're going to eat my animals. And the environmentalists on the other side were saying, well, we want wolves in the system. They're going to be good for the ecology. And how do you come up with a compromise? Well, the compromise was attributed to, I think, at least in my mind, to a really cool entrepreneur, enviropreneur named Hank Fisher. And Hank Fisher worked for Defenders of Wildlife, advocate of wolf reintroduction. And he would go to these meetings with ranchers, and the ranchers would say things like, "Hank, I can't believe anybody hadn't killed you yet," because that's how unpopular he was. But he kind of worked both sides of the table, and he got the environmental group, the Defenders of Wildlife, to raise money to pay ranchers for their losses. And so, this was back in 1995, and now compensation payments are really common. They exist in France, where wolves have spread. They exist in Spain, and in Wisconsin, and everywhere. So compensation is now pretty common, and that's a starting point because, you have at least initially, you had people who were making voluntary contributions to the Environmental Defense Fund because they wanted wolves, and they were going to pay for those who bore the cost. So there's shortcomings of the compensation programs. I'm happy to talk about those, but it's at least a starting point for now. How do you take that further? How do you take it further? You say, okay, well, now we're starting to discover that, and quantify some of these benefits. So the benefits in Wisconsin from a reduction in deer vehicle collisions that me and my co-authors attribute to the spread of wolves. We've talk about the details of this study, but we compare the timing of colonization of wolves in different counties in Wisconsin from the early 1990s to close to the present. And where wolves colonized these counties, we saw a 25% reduction in deer vehicle collisions. And we think 2/3 of that is due to wolves changing deer behavior rather than just eating deer. So then we took, what's the implied value of that reduction in deer vehicle collisions, due to lower probability of premature mortality of humans, which economists can put a statistical value to that. It's controversial, but we do. And what's the value of the property, the vehicle that was damaged? Add all that up, compare it to the verified losses due for ranch owners in Wisconsin, due to predation, direct predation from wolves. And that's a 63-to-1 number. So the benefits from wolves via the reduction in deer vehicle collisions is 63 times greater than the compensation payments the state was making for verified losses. So that's so those are verified losses. And you could say, and I think it's an important point, a livestock owner will say, well, wolves, they have these other indirect effects on my operation. They reduce the productivity of my animals because they're scared, they're threatened. And so those losses are probably bigger to ranchers than the verified losses just from predation. And I think that's completely valid, completely true. I'd love to measure it. We're trying to through other research. But still a 63-to-1 ratio is a big difference. And so this goes back to your earlier point. I mean, is there a way to get, drivers in rural communities who benefit from a lower threat of deer vehicle collisions, sort of to chip in for the damages that wolves cause?
That's 63-to-1, and even if we halve that because we say the measurements are imperfect and call it 30-to-1, there's not many opportunities out there where you can invest in something at a 31 return. So that's pretty impressive. And I guess the other side of that is it's quite, if you knew there was a 60 or 30-to-1 return out there, you'd expect people to be queuing at your door trying to, where can I invest in that? So the fact that this has slipped through the cracks for so long and we haven't seen it is also a very interesting kind of mirror into the way we think about problems. And but what, in terms of, like, the wolves is such a beautiful example of this, but I'm sure it's not the only one out there. So where else do you see opportunities to sort of use this kind of thinking in terms of our food systems and sustainability? And the other side is that what's the role of governments or markets or incentivizing and disincentivizing certain behaviors to try and guide policies that will lead to these better outcomes?
Yeah, on your point that it's surprising to slip through the cracks. That's one of the big values of scientific research, I think, like this, is to try to cast light and quantify some of the complex things that are happening in ecological and agricultural systems, so that we have better information on which to base policy. So data-driven information. And so that's I think one reason is we didn't have it quantified in this way until pretty recently. The other potential reason is these effects are likely variable in different places. So we have a follow-up study with co-authors that I've worked with on wolf issues, looking at Quebec, Canada. And so there's wolves on one side of the St. Lawrence River and have been for 100 years. On the other side, there isn't. And we're finding very similar effects, that there's much higher deer animal vehicle collisions. These ones include moose in Canada on the side that doesn't have wolves. And so, but I don't know if the effects look the same in other parts of the world and other parts of the country. And so, so the 30-to-1 opportunity, maybe it's 15-to-1 in some places, and 30-to-1 in others, and 100-to-1 in others, because ecological conditions are different and the human interactions are different. In terms of economic incentives and policies that can kind of steer us closer to optimal levels of prey and predators in a system, we have some new technologies and some innovative things that are happening on both fronts, in terms of compensating landowners for hosting ungulates and for hosting predators even. One example that's pretty new is a group in the Western US that is paying landowners for presence. So it's setting up wildlife cameras on property. And if the animals are spotted, there's literally a menu list of, a wolf is worth this much, a grizzly bear is worth this much, elk is worth this much. This is recognizing that for landowners, these animals could be perceived to be a liability. If they're perceived to be a liability, they're not going to feel welcoming towards them. That could hurt long run efforts towards compensation. And so we're actually we're gonna pay them not only if they lose an animal due to predation, but just if they're hosting animals. And that kind of takes you to a next level of economic contracting where I'm like, that's a pretty sophisticated contract. Where and then it starts to change the incentives of the landowner. Like, oh, now this animal's more of an asset than a liability. And I'm recognizing that people value it. They're putting money where their mouth is. They're not just forcing it down my throat and telling me I can't do anything to manage these animals that are a threat to my livelihood. But instead, like, oh, I'm gonna get compensated. Maybe at the margin, I install a more friendly wildlife fence that allows them to, elk to move more freely. Because I actually wouldn't mind them on my property. I'm not trying to keep them out. And maybe I dedicate a little bit more of my land to wildlife habitat. And so your interests are in long run sustainability in these ecological and agricultural systems. Well, these kinds of advanced ways of economic contracting, it's the basics of a market interaction, as you know, is can you make an agreement with someone? If X happens, I'll pay you Y. And then you're more likely to get that if this kind of cooperative payment system. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question you raised, but I wanted to point that out as a I don't know, kind of a frontier form of economic contracting that really accounts for incentives, for economic
That
incentives as primary to resource sustainability.
that's fascinating. I think adding to that, the back on the indirect effects, which I'm sure there's a lot of work to measure some of these, but excuse me, there's there's lots of research out there that if you're grazing a pasture with a combination of sheep and goats and cows or cattle, you'll get a better utilization of that pasture. And the goats will eat certain species that the sheep won't, and the sheep will eat certain things that the cattle won't. And as long as you don't overgraze it, having those multiple species is highly beneficial to the land and to the regrowth and the amount of pasture you're growing. So there's no reason to believe that having non-domesticated grazers on the land wouldn't have similar benefits in terms of things like woody weeds or various different other parts of what grows there. So that goes back in again into what are the direct and indirect consequences and benefits of these kind of policies. But speaking to, you mentioned the gentleman who started the program in Washington, in Yellowstone in the mid 90s, and how he was not overly popular among the ranching communities. How have you seen attitudes with these communities and with the people whose land this is happening on changing over the years?
I mean, there is in some ways a new generation of ranchers and farmers, and I think their views on predators are complex and they're varied. So not every farmer and rancher feels the same way about predators, but certainly the ones that I interact with are very open to listening to to learning from research findings, and if you have some data driven evidence, they want to hear that. I think what's probably been similar over time is landowners and ranchers are pretty resistant to top-down regulatory controls on their land use. And so one thing that is probably a constant, more or less, is something like the Endangered Species Act in the US, which constrains how a rancher or farmer can react to a threat from wildlife, is something that they bristle at. And it's because it's a regulatory stick rather than a carrot. And so one of the ways in which the Endangered Species Act has improved, and I think helped with landowner and farmer perceptions of wildlife, is there's over time, since the act was passed in the 70s, there's been amendments like a safe harbor agreement, and other amendments that have recognized that this doesn't seem that fair to landowners, to farmers, to ranchers. And moreover, if we really want successful species conservation, we want the landowners and farmers and ranchers to be more like allies to us than enemies. And so things like the Safe Harbor Agreement will begin to compensate landowners for protecting habitat rather than destroying habitat, and certainly not penalizing them for protecting habitat. So one example of an unintended consequence of the Endangered Species Act is, if you become regulated under the act, it's a violation of the law to destroy habitat on which an endangered species relies. And so in anticipation of that future constraint on your economic options, some landowners preemptively destroy habitat. A good example is the red cockaded woodpecker in North Carolina. It nests in old growth trees. Landowners know this. They know that once they have red cockaded woodpeckers in their trees, they can't cut them. And so, in some of these areas, forestry is a source of economic profit. So what do the landowners do in these places? Well, they would preemptively cut trees so they couldn't provide habitat. Amendments to the Endangered Species Act have lessen that problem. And so it's a long-winded way of saying, attitudes are changing, but attitudes in part are a function of policies that recognize some of the costs that wildlife can cause to landowners.
And I guess the big thing there is incentivize versus disincentivize. If society realizes the benefit of wolves or the pet woodpeckers or other species and are willing to compensate the or rancher to house those and look after them on their land, then obviously you're creating a mutual benefit for both groups, rather than the more top-down regulatory approach.
Absolutely, yeah.
And we've talked a lot about wolves and grazing systems and ranching systems, but are there other areas that you've been studying where you see, I guess, not necessarily similar, but you see the complexities between the direct and the indirect benefits of things that you could also share?
Yeah, so I study natural resources and I teach courses in the economics of natural resource management. And so we talk about renewable resources and non-renewable resources, and also water, which is kind of in between the two, right? You have groundwater supplies are renewable in some sense, but they can take a long time to regenerate. I study fisheries and forests and other resources like that. And one of the conclusions that I've come to over the years of both researching these topics and teaching on their conservation is that if you want long-term resource conservation and sustainability, we need policies that cause users of those resources to treat them like they're the owner. Now, we might not want to convey ownership, it might not be practical or politically feasible or even socially desirable for individuals and groups to own uh, every natural resource. But if they if we have policies that encourage them to act as if they own it, then the incentives are going to be aligned for long-term conservation. And so, you have these interactions between short-term use and long-term conservation, and some of those are through direct and some are through indirect channels. So take water, for example. So water is a key input for agriculture and food systems. Globally, it's by far the dominant use of fresh water, and this is groundwater and surface water. But water is becoming scarce in many places. There's annual fluctuations that vary, of course, by region, but the long-term trend has generally been a decline in groundwater. Certainly in arid places in the US, but globally, like India, for example. And so, I'm interested in why is that resource becoming scarce, and what can economics offer in terms of trying to encourage better long-term conservation of water supplies.
And I love what you said about treating treating the entity or the object of conservation as, or having people treat that as they would own it. Because if you think, if you see something that you own, then you will likely see that as an asset that you want to maintain and preserve and maintain the value of, rather than as something that you want to, destroy or get rid of.
So if the question is why is groundwater becoming more scarce in many parts of the world? Well, there's proximate causes. I guess these are the direct causes. There's growing demand for water from urban users, through agricultural systems, even for manufacturing of chips, for example. It's very water intensive. But there's a more fundamental root cause, I think, and that's due to the governance of water and policies governing water that do not create strong incentives for long-run conservation. They don't mimic ownership arrangements. They don't allow the user to think of the resource as if they owned it, and hence a long-run asset to try to preserve over time. And that's really, like, if you think about groundwater, there's a lack of clear ownership. Groundwater aquifers can span large subsurface areas, and they can be underneath lots of surface parcels. And so it's like a common pool resource. If you drill a well in one part of the aquifer, you're drawing water that other people could use. And so this creates incentives as if the resource is like sometimes like an open access resource, or certainly like common property. And so if the system is set up by the rule of capture, that is to say, I own the water only once I withdraw it from the aquifer, then my incentive is to withdraw water from the aquifer and use it before others can use the resource. And so the rule of capture is a very weak ownership structure, and it's prevalent all across the world. And so I think that's fundamental to the problem, at least of groundwater depletion, is this, who owns it? And so how do you set up systems for which, what are the causes of that insecure ownership or insecure rights, and how do you change the system? Well, one issue is there's often use it or lose it laws to waters for surface and groundwater. This is common across the world. So, if you don't use the water, you lose your rights. So this is like the rule of capture. The economic incentives this creates are really obvious, and they're easy to describe to students. And so when I do so, they can see right away, like, this is not a sustainable incentive structure. I mean, but there's other issues with water, like, in some places of the world, we subsidize water use. Often governments subsidize energy use. So if electricity is used to pump water from groundwater and we're subsidizing electricity, we're going to get more groundwater pumped than we would get without those subsidies. You've seen that in parts of India, for example. And another issue with water is there's restrictions on trading. And so even if I have a claim to a pertinent water in a river next to my property, or if I have a fairly secure right to groundwater that I could pump from the ground, there's specific restrictions on how I can use it. Like it might have to be employed for beneficial use as defined by the state. Well, the state defines beneficial use sometimes in ways that's beneficial for generating revenue from the state. So like, the beneficial use might not be to keep the water in river or in ground. So if I'm a water conservationist and I've raised money to try to keep water in stream, maybe for fish habitat, or keep water in the ground for future conservation, as an owner, you are often disallowed to make an agreement with me where the environmental group pays you as a landowner to conserve the water. There's restrictions on that because conservation is not defined in the law as a beneficial use. So it's a very that's a strict restriction on water marketing, on water trading, and economic contracting for conservation. And you're not going to get the owner or the user to act as a full owner would.
What's quite evident from everything we've discussed is that the indirect effects keep on cascading and are much more complex than the direct effects. And going back to the water use side of things, in certain states, to maintain water rights, you have to keep livestock on your property, and so you end up with people owning livestock purely for the main reason of maintaining their water licenses and their water rights, rather than actually because they want to be livestock producers. And so there's the environmental impact of those livestock and the fact that they're not as efficiently managed as someone who's a full-time livestock producer, and that just leads back into the incentives that are there for that drive behavior. So I know this is the very open-ended question, and there's no simple answer to this, but in terms of what can be done to actually start to alter policies to align the outcomes with the benefits to the whole community, what are your thoughts on that?
In the case of water, I think eliminating use it or lose it laws is a starting point. So you can get new demanders of water to interact with kind of traditional uses. So traditional uses of water have been for agricultural production and for mining, sluicing mining. But there's new demands for water, and if at least those new demanders, some who want water to be kept in basin for ecological benefits, so for fish habitat, for example, or wildlife habitat, if you can at least set up a system where they can do business with one another, I think you're likely to get more beneficial long-run uses of water, non-uses of water, conservation. So I think changes that just make markets more possible are going to help with water. And certainly getting rid of subsidies that encourage over excessive use of water, I think is a pretty obvious policy change. And so those are two with respect to water.
Wonderful. We're basically out of time. So before we go, is there anything that you'd like to add that we haven't already discussed?
At the beginning, you asked, how I became interested in wolves and their complex interactions with local communities. And I will say I worked in Yellowstone National Park in 1994. I was a 20-year-old student at the time, and I just worked there for a summer. And right at that time, there was, the top discussion in Yellowstone was the reintroduction of wolves. And so I was exposed to all the arguments for and against that were happening. I mean, this is what people in the Yellowstone region were talking about at that time. And so that is, as I moved forward in my career and ended up getting a PhD in economics with an emphasis on environmental science. It was something I always wanted to study. Like, can we quantify some of these effects that we hear? There's some barstool talk about the ecological and economic impacts, but can we apply these economic tools, in particular the empirical tools, to try to begin to understand what some of these costs and benefits might look like once you incorporate the full system, direct and indirect. And so that was kind of the origin of my interest in this topic.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. It's great to, that journey. It's great to see the inspiration that working in Yellowstone has had and how that's kind of, come back in at a later state. So that's really cool to hear.
Thank you.
So, Nick, thank you very much for joining me today. Thank you.
Appreciate it. It's great to be here.
Thank you for listening to The Ash Cloud with me, Ash Sweeting, in conversation with Nick Parker. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to The Ash Cloud, where I continue to discuss food sustainability with guests who bring a deep understanding of the environmental, political and cultural challenges facing our societies and creative ideas on how to address them.